Hello and welcome to a special Digital Foundry interview. I'm John Linneman, of course, and I'm joined today by a very special guest coming straight to us from Insomniac Games, having just finished Marvel Spider-Man 2. Mike Fitzgerald, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's exciting to get to talk about this game finally.
And just for those that aren't aware, what do you do on the Spider-Man project?
So I'm the director of our core technology department at Insomniac. We're a cross-project team. So we're doing the engine and tools that our game teams use to build the games and that underpin the runtime of the games themselves. So I get to have
Excellent.
my hands in everything going on at the studio, which is fun.
Obviously, I've been playing Spider-Man 2, just put out a video on it as I'm talking to you now. But I wanted to get your first impressions and first thoughts on the approach that you wanted to take in building this new game. Like, what were the key features that stood out in your mind where you're like, okay, this is where we want to take the technology for this next title?
Well, the fun thing to do is always take a photo of New York City and put it next to the game. Try and find the exact perspective, right? And then say, well, where are we falling short of this? Now, photoreal is not exactly the goal. I think it's more Marvel real or game real or something, some sort of somewhat exaggerated, dramatic interpretation of it. But, off the top of my head, some of the things we pointed out were our buildings got a bit flat in the distance. The lighting would drop out. They didn't have a lot of macro breakup and variation. So that was one thing we were excited about. Ray traced reflections on our PS5 launch titles were awesome, but there were still a lot of tricks and fakes around there around building interiors, which was a fun area we were excited to tackle. And then as soon as we knew we were doing Brooklyn and Queens, we knew we'd be going across the river and we'd be having a whole set of unique challenges with the water rendering and things there. But really it's, you get to the end of one game and the whole team gets to pick up and look a bit farther to the metaphorical horizon about what they're doing and get ambitious and think about crazy things they want to try. And so everyone has their own little pet thing to do. For sure. Doing,
That's awesome.
Doing Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart gave us a lot of fun ideas about how to do loading and streaming differently in Spider-Man as well.
Oh yeah, and that's something we do want to get to, but I actually want to start with one of the things that really caught my eye when looking at the game myself, and it's the building interiors. So for those watching the video, you may have noticed this: every single building, every one of these skyscrapers now features what looks like a fully modeled interior with dynamic characters even sitting around inside these rooms. And we had our hypothesis, but I'd actually like to hear directly from you. What are you guys doing to pull that off? How did you solve this problem?
Yeah, I saw it. Great job. I think noticing the checkerboarding was a great tell. So those are ray traced interiors for rooms, and what we're doing is almost path tracing that space in a sense with sort of simplistic geometry and lighting. But taking a step back, I think we had the cube map technique in the previous games, which is it's always clever and fun and fun to crawl around corners and look in and notice all the oddnesses of it. And we actually had another technique we were trying on top of that, which was to add sort of a parallax depth to the interior. And you could get these sort of 3D shapes, especially along the back wall, like if you wanted to put a desk back there or bookshelves on the sides, like that sort of convex, yeah, sure, geometry along the walls and back looked quite good. But a couple really talented folks on our render team sort of proposed this idea of, hey, every window we hit, we're tracing rays out into the world. Why not render an interior by using that same system and tossing rays elsewhere? So we have, I think, 32 fake rooms deep underground the city, buried somewhere below the ground plane. And they have sort of a basic layout and then different variations on furniture and characters that might be in there. And then as you trace into a room, we use sort of an ID for that window. Okay, so floor 5, window 3 of, the building at this corner, we'll use this room and this sort of random set of interiors for that room. And then we can filter the BVH down to that, hit exactly some set of objects in there, even animated objects like ceiling fans or characters who might be watching TV. We have some pre-calculated lighting in there, and we also can cast rays back through the real window to get a sense for the key light, where the sun is, where the shadows might be entering the room, and all that. And it worked. I guess it's really what there is to say about it. It comes together really nicely. You get that sense of movement back there that adds a lot, and that's how we did the interiors for this game.
And also those perfect shadows, of course, a benefit of tracing into those scenes. I think shadow maps that would be expensive and probably not look very good.
Yeah, so not for each window, certainly.
No.
Yeah.
I also liked how even on the sides of buildings, you could sometimes see an office and look, and there'd be a back door at the rear of that office that seemed to go around into the other side of the building, and it's just it's a very clever trick, and that is seriously a very difficult problem to solve. And I think this is the first time I've seen a game tackle it in such an elegant fashion, where you really do get the feeling of depth on all the buildings. But another aspect of this depth that really caught my interest is the way you handled basically secondary reflections. So, like, this is something I pointed out in my video for Miles Morales back at the launch of PS5, but, when you have two windows side by side, they're going to reflect on each other, and then the reflection within the reflection should also appear in that. And that was absent in those original games. But I notice here, it is actually present, and I'm wondering what the source is for those secondary reflections. How did you actually solve this problem,
Yeah, mostly we use just a plain sort of probe of that area, what the reflections were before we had ray traced reflections. We can fall back to that technique anywhere, just like we do on any very rough surfaces in that area. We're using some sort of runtime or baked calculation of what's around there, because you don't really need to see movement in it the way you need to with ray traced reflections. And so it's a great fallback for a secondary bounce and a reflection as well. It works for buildings. It helps with cars a lot too, which I think looked a bit flat in reflections before. And when they have a nice,
good point,
clear coat on them, you want to give a bit of that. So.
Yeah, I noticed the nice clear coat on those cars zooming in, very sparkly paint.
We put a lot of work into that. Actually. that was always a pet peeve in the last games. Like, the car shader could be a little bit better. So
I know I actually have some shots in my video. I'm going to show them here now because we couldn't exceed a certain amount of runtime in the video, so I didn't get to show everything I wanted to. And that's one of the things is the paint shader. It looks awesome. So that's another nice touch and a big improvement.
Some materials folks,
but of course,
will love hearing that.
Yes,
absolutely.
Yeah, they did an awesome job. The materials in general definitely feel like a step up, especially on the more minute objects, the smaller objects. But I don't want to get away from ray tracing just yet, obviously, because another big thing, obviously one of the biggest things then, is the water reflections, which are now ray traced. And this discussion has been interesting because I think a lot of people, especially with the way games used to work, maybe didn't consider how rough, choppy water actually behaves when light sort of refracts and reflects off its surface, right? But I am curious to see how you tackled this challenge, both in terms of like how you leverage the existing ray tracing features, but also how you handle something like this rough water, which is obviously not like a smooth, glossy surface. The reflection is more diffuse. So what kind of extra cost are we looking at? How'd you pull it off? Let's hear some secrets here.
There's always a lot of balance with this. I think pretty early on, as soon as we had gameplay happening over the water, whether it was a mission like we showed in our first gameplay demo, or some early wingsuit, or it wasn't even wingsuit then, but just trying to get over to where the Brooklyn and Queens were, you very quickly see it fall apart. And actually, there's a lot of screenshots of the first game on PS4 where the building reflections fall apart really bad. You get this full silhouette of the character in front of it.
Yeah.
And we just knew we could do better. But when you sort of naively drop ray tracing on that water, the performance spikes far too high. It was really expensive. We even tried to get around it a few other ways. We tried doing kind of a planar reflection technique, like rendering from underneath up through the water at the full scene. But hey, rendering a whole other scene is really expensive as well. And then trying to translate that into the roughness of the water didn't quite work. And so we sort of got to a point where we said, the ray tracing is going to be the right way to do this. So how can we mitigate that performance? Our graphics programmers are awesome. And the one in particular who focuses on this stuff, he did a great job trying to find the right compromises that you don't notice in the same way when you're looking at water as opposed to windows. So we actually render the water reflections at quarter res on horizontal because they're so stretched out, you don't notice that at all. And this is always this fun march of when you're focused on optimizing one thing, you get the progress updates during the day, and it's like, hey, here's a side-by-side. This one is literally half as many rays, half the performance cost. It looks exactly the same to everyone, right? And everyone's like, yeah, pretty much. And so it's like finding those little bits where you can save time and effort to do that. A big one for water that makes it so expensive is it's so choppy that your rays shoot in all different directions, and that's really inefficient for ray tracing hardware. So how can you bin them? How can you group them? How can you maybe not shoot them in exactly the right direction, but one that's close enough and yet is more coherent with what's nearby, where you can pull some extra performance out of the hardware? And really, it's just pulling that thread over and over repeatedly, and eventually getting to a point where we could do it in performance mode as well, which was huge for the quality of performance mode.
That's interesting. So yeah, I was wondering about hitting 60 FPS or higher with ray traced water. So I guess there was a point. Actually, that's another question in general. Like, do you remember the point where you're like, you know what, we're just gonna go all ray tracing here and drop the fallbacks? Like, did that happen early in development? Was that always the goal, or was it just like you just happened to get enough performance that you were able to say, yeah, we can actually do this?
Well, it has always pained me whenever I see a screenshot of the first couple Spider-Man games or Ratchet and Clank with ray tracing turned off, and I always know it immediately when I see a screenshot. It always bums me out. And so it was always an aspiration for this one, I think. It was like, man, wouldn't it be great if we didn't have to have that real big compromise in there, if we got back to sort of a pure performance and resolution more trade-off. And I don't think we committed to it until earlier this year. But I think basically we saw the way performance was trending, and we said, it'll be work, but let's go for it. I feel like we got there with the last games, but we always got there like a week after launch or like right at the deadline, and we were never quite confident enough. And so this time it just took a bit of no, we're gonna do it, and we can get it to where it needs to be.
I like the word trending, because that's something I think that's really important to consider when optimizing any of these games, is that you have to think very far ahead in the future, right? Like, you can't just say at the last minute, like, yeah, we're going to do a 60 FPS mode. It's going to be something that's really planned early on and worked towards. Yeah. And obviously that must have been a lot of hard work to get going with all that ray tracing going on, because it's good stuff. But another thing about the ray tracing that was interesting is it seems like the particles, not all of them, but many of the particles are now rendered in the ray traced reflection. And this is something that this was definitely not the case in the last games, and it seems like it wasn't even in one of the earlier trailers either. Yeah. So what's the story there?
Trailers are so funny. You make them, and I think there's this sort of perception that Well, it's all smoke and mirrors, and the real shipping game is not even going to look that good. But when our media team, who's awesome, is capturing those trailers, we're always thinking, well, don't put that scene in because we know we have this thing coming that's going to make it look better. And I think when the trailers come out, I know our core tech team is always thinking, oh, but it looks better now. Why couldn't how it looks now be what's in the trailer? So, yeah, in particular, I think it was the story trailer. In one of them, you're getting pulled up behind by Lizard up the side of a building, and there's this whole truck bouncing around, and there's all this fire and smoke, and none of that fire and smoke is reflected in the building. And I think the day the trailer came out is the day that we got that feature up and running and looked at that scene in the game, and we're like, oh, but it looks better now. So here, maybe you can find that scene and show people how it looks.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's the thing about that is, so I guess kind of like other things in the world, you can flag which particles you want to be included in the BVH, basically. Because I noticed like there's still some particles that are done with SSR, which is typically the more traditional method for that, I think, because it is difficult. But how do you actually like render them though? Like particles in RT in a 3D space like that, like that's just a strange thing, mathematically tricky, just in terms of how particles work. 'Cause they're just 2D objects, right? Usually.
Yeah,
So how does it work?
I want to say that that Abdul, who's the programmer who handles all this stuff, I want to say he had to set up sort of a in BVH billboarding mechanism to sort of hit something that would be billboarded towards the source of the ray and make sure that everything is reprojected in the right direction to then appear correctly in the reflection.
Ooh,
So,
that's pretty neat, actually.
yeah, like you said, we sort of pick and choose. A lot of what we do is, as we're approaching the end of a game, we say, well, this can look better, and then you make it so that certain types of particles can be in the reflection, certain VFX can be there, but then you don't want to necessarily blanket apply it everywhere because you might tank performance in some scene where it doesn't really matter and it's too late to sort of balance it all out. So we carefully pick and choose and find opportunities to make things look better.
Sure, that makes sense. I do actually want to ask you a little bit about the lighting as well for this game and the way you handled like global illumination and the different like baked lighting methods, and if there's any improvements there. But first, maybe start by explaining again, because I was discussing this with somebody, and I think there's actually interest in understanding again the way you guys do your pre-calculated lighting pass. So if you could quickly break that down for us.
So, so we have a GI bake across the city and in all the custom interiors for missions and things like that. The city's enormous, and it's twice as big in this game. And we always want to be increasing the quality of that bake, whether it's resolution or whether we capture specular as well. You know, like all these different factors of the light that we're baking in and exposing to the real-time part of the game. And it's funny, this stuff takes ages to bake across the city, and also the city's changing every day during development. So you can't just ask a team like, well, if you're working on this street corner, make sure you rebake all the lighting there. Like they don't want to sit there for an hour to rebake it all just because they move some stuff around. So in this game, we actually worked quite a bit on the non-glamorous part that doesn't show up in the final product in a sense, but lets us iterate on all that more easily and cleanly. And we're able to, we used to have a farm of machines that were baking the city over a week, and now it's like one machine can bake the sunset sort of lighting setup in like 4 days or something like that. So that's a big iterative thing for us as we go. Looking at the city, and I mentioned some big picture things about it versus a real New York, and one is all our dynamic lighting had to stop at some point in the distance. And as well now we sort of have a version of the light bake for the entire level, the entire world that can be loaded at one time. So you still get that if you're looking towards the opposite end of the city or looking. This is another thing that across the river made tough is looking from the east side of Manhattan across to Brooklyn. You're looking at something very far away, but also there's nothing in between you and it, right? In Manhattan, there's a lot of far away stuff, but usually there's buildings close and that's where you're seeing. But this was something far, far away that was also all you cared about and wanted to look at. So we needed to make sure our lighting over there was good as well. So it's a nice side by side of seeing how much farther real dynamic lighting at street level and real GI bakes in between the buildings holds up at a distance.
Yeah, and there's a good amount of times of day in this, so each one of those is its own separate bake. Like, just offhand, do you have any idea, like, roughly how much larger the lighting data is compared to, like, say, Spider-Man on PS4?
I don't recall exactly what it was on PS4, but I know we were so constrained by how big things were and to stream it off the disc that it couldn't have been quite large. I want to say on this disc that the lighting data for the open world is maybe a third of the disc, something like that. It's a pretty substantial component of the data.
That's a big chunk.
And the team goes through a lot of work to compress that data, find efficient ways of storing it, putting it in formats that can be nicely compressed by the Kraken compressor on the PS5. And so there's all sorts of tricks to get stuff to fit on a Blu-ray, which is a challenge of its own, and then also stay small enough to stream in as you play the game.
Cool. Yeah. Thinking of the lighting though, real quick, I'm just wondering if you've, like, looking forward, you guys are really pushing ray tracing on the PS5. Have you explored the cost of something like doing ray traced global illumination? Do you think it's actually feasible on these platforms in a game like this, or is it still just a little bit too much, especially if you factor in the reflection pass?
Every game has its own trade-offs and environment and style of play. I think one thing we looked at was, I mean, we're in New York City. The reflections are just hugely important for the look of that space. And we would never want to sacrifice any of that for something else. Another component is we move so fast through that space that we can't afford much time for rendering techniques to sort of resolve. And that's moving through it. That's also camera cuts and things like that.
Denoising it.
And it's something I notice as a compromise of ray trace GI is that these scenes need time to settle. I mean, that's a broad generalization. Some people are doing some awesome stuff with it. But for us, I know we wanted to focus on reflections and make sure, any quick traversal through the city was really looking stable and correct, I guess, as much as we could as you were moving through it. But all that stuff is so exciting. I mean, you can do some gorgeous stuff with those techniques. So we won't be ignoring them.
There we go. Of course, you mentioned New York, and another part of New York is, of course, the density of stuff. And that's something I really noticed and picked up on here. It's just like there's just so much more traffic, just pedestrians, plus just more general detail from any perch where you just look. It feels like there's detail closer to the player. And maybe you could talk a little bit about all those different factors and how that's changed for this game.
It's funny to see people talk about it a bit because there's this notion of, there's LODs and you just watch everything transition in and out of them. But I think there's like 10 or 15 interlocking systems that all factor into how detailed something might look. You have textures streaming in and out at different distances to the camera and blending into each other. You have models with LODs that you see at different distances. You have our imposter system, which is for distant buildings. How do you represent those in a low poly way that you can keep in memory all the time, at any time? Run up a building, look, you can see the whole world in Brooklyn and Queens now. How do we represent those efficiently? When do we transition to something better looking, etc.? So in this game, we added a new high-res version of those imposters. So there's a new middle distance version of a building that has more geometric detail than the far ones, but isn't yet independent models for different pieces that we need to render. But you do get real reflective windows on those. It's like that's part of the transition, Pete. We also have a lot of objects that need to exist at a distance. Things like big air conditioning units or antennas on top of buildings or water towers, which affect silhouettes. So even though that's a small object you'd want to stream in, well, it's going to very obviously pop in as you get close to it or appear. And we want far buildings to have those sort of distinctive shapes on top of their silhouettes. So those exist as sort of these independent models that we have showing at different distances, far away and close. The windows have their own techniques to blend at different distances. The materials have their own levels of detail as height effects and parallax occlusion comes in and out on them as you get close and far. And the goal is to make it all invisible, so your brain fills in the details for the far stuff and makes you feel like it's the same as if you were standing next to it.
Yeah, that's definitely something I really noticed, especially sitting up on some of those perches. Just the general variety across the scene, because like, you know, in the original you kind of look out at the buildings and there's a point where they just kind of turn to blocks, you know what I mean? And it's, you know, within the constraints of a PS4, right? But here it feels like there's much more subtlety on every surface from a distance, which does make a huge difference in terms of quality. And then of course,
well, so to speak to the wear and tear on buildings, since
please.
You mention it, sort of the blocky flat sides. One thing we did was we introduced this bake step on buildings kind of that looks at their geometry and says, well, if it had been raining here for 50 years, like here's where the grime would be around the windowsills, or this is a wear pattern on the side of this building. That can be a dynamic input to a material and shader when you're close to it. But since we bake those imposters, we can bake it right into that unique imposter. So you can get, yes, that's a brick building, and we have we have many brick materials, but for the side of that building, it's a brick material. But we get to feed in this sort of macro breakup to that brick material that gives it, oh, there was a mural here and it faded away 10 years ago, and so you have this sort of like chunk of color over here, like that type of thing. And that has added a lot of variety looking out over Manhattan that makes it feel less cartoony and more real.
Actually, thinking of though, I mentioned traversal, and I'm curious if you can speak on that a little bit, because that's another new thing. It's like the speed of traversal. What did that look like for you guys in terms of implementing that? Because the camera can now just fly across the screen. It feels like 3-4 times as much, 3 or 4 times the speed of what was possible in the original game.
Yeah, certainly that was something we felt the potential for with Miles and Spider-Man Remastered, but didn't want those games to feel different on PS5 versus PS4. We had balanced that gameplay and had all the systems put out, and so we knew we wanted to push it a bit farther. The wings were a great opportunity to do that. As you upgrade yourself in the game, I think you can go about twice as fast as in the first couple games. And then there's the super slingshots on the building tops that fire you off about 3 times as fast. There's some cinematic moments that I think you caught in your review video that really have fun with moving the camera quickly through that space. It's funny. It's the hardware in the console is extremely good. You know, it's very fast SSD and all this. We've talked about this a million times. But part of what you need to do then is work on, well, how fast can your engine interpret that data as it's loading it in? Because that's now your bounding factor on stuff. And we also do a lot of, how can we get less data? How much less can you load? Does that make sense? Like, and there's a lot of creativity around that. One of the ones I really liked in this game is one of our animation programmers came up with a way to stream animations in a sense. Now, how do I describe this? Spider-Man is like a very complex character. He's got, a million different moves and blends and state machines, and he can fly and swing and punch guys. And the amount of animation data you have for a character is enormous. But what if we're not playing them all simultaneously? So you don't need all that data at the same time. But
True.
The gameplay needs to be reactive. You might need it next frame or 2 frames from now, and not, not know ahead of time. You can't get ready for that. And so he came up with a system where many animations, they have every 3rd or 4th frame resident in memory all the time. And then when you go to play it, then we hit the SSD, fill in all the extra frames of animation. And at worst, you're looking at like 1 frame that blends imperfectly into the next, but really it's like completely seamless. And you just cut your animation streaming costs by 75 or 80%. So that type of creativity across different groups, that you don't see that, but it comes through. That's the sort of thing that enables that fast traversal and streaming through the world.
And so this is actually an interesting discussion point that I've seen brought up often, actually, with this traversal and fast loading and all that. Conceptually, being able to load, like to go directly down into a map, or like load quickly to another area, or use portals, this stuff has existed in other games prior to, like Ratchet, prior to the Spider-Man games. But I think based on what you've said here and other things, just knowing about this game, the difference isn't so much what you're doing, it's the amount of data that's being moved to do it, right?
I can't speculate too much on what they're doing, but here's some of what's gotten us to where we are. One is that even on PS4, we had that sort of imposter system notion. We have this notion of a low-res version of the city that's always around. That was a great boon when it came time to do ray trace reflections, because that was the foundation of that system. Similarly, it's a great boon just jumping into a fast travel system of some sort, where there's something ready there, right? And it looks a lot like that pause map. We were able to be working with PlayStation 5 hardware very early. We've gotten a lot of time with this hardware. It has pushed us in that sense to make a lot of these systems more flexible and dynamic, to make sure our texture streaming is prioritizing things correctly and efficiently hitting that hardware, to make sure we can unload stuff as dramatically and quickly as we can when we no longer need it. And really, it has been an iterative walk through, those early games, through our launch titles, through Ratchet and Clank, to this game, where we are continually building on that ability to quickly get rid of what we don't need, only keep what we need next time, quickly bring in the most important stuff, and let some more come in as we go. Even knowing, like, as you look through a portal, well, I need to stream in this texture on the other side of the portal, even though it's dramatically far from where my camera happens to be at the moment, right? And making sure all those systems fit together.
That's cool.
Really nicely.
So we're probably coming up on the limit here, but I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about sound, because this is something I really picked up on, especially as a user of a surround sound system. And I wonder if you can talk about how some of these things work. How does the room propagation work? How does the sound reflections work?
These are techniques that have sort of been around for a while, and one of the problems is how to sort of consistently apply them to a complicated world, how to give the right tools for authoring them, how to make something that can run efficiently at runtime to truly give a sense for that. So there's sound propagating through rooms. There's sound sort of reverberating in the correct way when you're between buildings. One of my favorite ones, actually, is there's some rainy moments in the game. And that system is sort of projects out around you, understands all the surfaces that rain might be hitting, and then plays the correct sort of sounds and mixes it correctly. So if you're on a rooftop and there is an aluminum AC vent 10 feet away from you, then as you walk towards it, you will hear the sound of rain hitting aluminum as opposed to the rain hitting a rubber rooftop, and you will hear it spatialized correctly in that space. So I know the audio team and our audio programmers take a lot of pride over that and how they've sort of applied these techniques through the spaces that we have. I wish I could show you the debug visualization for the rain. It's really cool. It's all these like hexagons around you that sort of visualize out the space and show you what it's hitting and finding. So,
thinking of spatial audio then, one of the big features in the recent PlayStation firmware was the addition of Dolby Atmos support, where it can basically take the Tempest audio data and, you know, create a real 3D effect in a setup that has Atmos support. I'm curious what kind of visibility you as a developer have on that feature, and if you can actually do any sort of custom mix for Atmos, or if it's just taking the Tempest audio data that's created for headphones and applying it over.
So by default, we get a great application of the sort of Tempest 3D spatialization to an Atmos setup. But with the new updates, we can actually have the game target Atmos more specifically. Our cinematics audio team did a ton of custom Atmos mixes for this game. As soon as they knew it was coming, they hopped on it immediately. And we're super excited to be, I think, the first PlayStation game, I don't know, if not close to it, that has custom Atmos mixes for its game. So yeah, I think we're right as this feature came out, so I think we timed it just about right. So yes, if you do have an Atmos setup, you get some awesome mixes through cinematics and
yeah, that stuff's really cool.
Game.
So, is there anything else you want to wrap up with? Anything you're especially proud of in the game? Something you wanted to highlight, where you're just like, man, this is something I really loved working on. Any thoughts on that? That's a tricky one to pull out of my hat, but
I want to give a shout out to some of the mundane problems that you don't see like
in the action, right? Yeah.
As you play the game, but are so important. There's like I mentioned before, that we have to fit this game on a Blu-ray disc. I mean, you can go multiple Blu-rays, but the goal is to fit it on one. And this game, I want to say, is only maybe 20% larger than Spider-Man Remastered as far as the disc size is concerned. But the amount of extra fidelity and quality and cinematics we packed in there is huge. And this factors into streaming and how we utilize that bandwidth as well. So one example, we have a ton of animation data in this game. Our faces are more detailed. Our bodies are more detailed. One of the first things we showed was a cinematic with Craven where he's kind of like hunting another hunter and kind of bored because it's not challenging enough for him. And I think we made that cinematic, and the animation team, you know, animated it the way they wanted, and then it was like a gigabyte in size. And we were like, this is a 30-second cinematic shot. It can't take up more than a full % of the disc. We're never going to ship a game. And so finding ways to take that data, our technical animation team came up with some awesome, sort of like reverse skinning and joint setups, and a lot of teams, a couple folks in my department put a lot of work into understanding the Kraken compressor and how we can work with textures and things to just cram everything down small, fit it on a disc, make sure people have a good size download that's not too onerous to fit on their console, and deliver something that I think you put it side to side, it feels head and shoulders above the first game, and yet is only like a little bit larger. So that's the kind of like behind the scenes thing that's fun. What else? You mentioned pedestrian and open world stuff. Vehicles have suspensions and behave differently now. You see a lot more behavior around pedestrians in cars. The pedestrians walking around the world can go in and out of buildings and shops, which they didn't do before. They have varying body sizes, and their outfits are much more randomized and swapped around. So you get a lot more just diversity of space and character. They have conversations with each other. There's this whole modular conversation system where they can have a topic and discuss it, and then one disagrees and the other knows how to like disagree or change the topic. And it's not, it's really fun to just sit and kind of listen to people around the city have these sort of reasonable conversations with each other as you walk around. There's all sorts of little touches. I'm excited for people to spend some time with the game, find random stuff, hopefully have some wow moments and how did they do that moments. And that's part of the fun of a new game, I guess.
Yeah, you kind of get that right from the start with the Sandman fight, where it's just like, oh, okay, this is huge, right away. That's a cool way to start.
Yeah, I know we showed it in the launch trailer, and people said, oh, spoiler, and I'm just like, it's the intro. So much stuff to experience. This is not ruining anything for anybody. I hope you're excited. Even just that one fight has so many surprises and twists and turns.
Indeed.
And there's some really awesome work that went into the bosses and cinematic moments across this game. So
I also appreciate you mentioned the Craven cutscene at the beginning, but that's not even in the city, right? Like that's a completely different like map, I guess, bespoke jungle map that was made just for that cutscene.
It's a little jungle space.
So you get this little jungle space, and that stuff's cool. You're able to seamlessly transition to these different spaces. And there's a bit more of that in there as well.
It was a fun challenge for our technical art team to say, well, yeah, it's only for this one cinematic, but we really want to have a realistic jungle and light propagation through a canopy, and the leaves have to have the right subsurface, and they have to slowly wave around and all that. So a lot of just effort goes into individual shots and spaces. But it's one of the great parts about working at the studios. People really care about their craft and want every little bit of it to look good and come across to players.
And I'm really happy to hear all that, and I'm glad that you guys are still pushing your own in-house technology. I know that's not easy to support, but it is something that people notice and appreciate, and it does help create these unique experiences, I think. So well done on the game is what I will say.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm just, again, excited for players to spend some time with it and have a good time.
All right. Well, I've probably used up enough of your time. We're coming up on 45 minutes here. So it was a pleasure to have you join us here to chat about Marvel Spider-Man 2. So I guess we'll find you in the credits somewhere, obviously, when people get there. But yeah. Hopefully you guys enjoyed
Thank you so much.
this little interview, and we'll see you next time.